Plague Party by J. Wilburn. Hudson passed the thickest of the trees along the pine straw covered road. I'm still not sure where the dashes need to go in there, but I'm going to get to that later at some point. He had missed the turn for the column of smoke he was tracking, so he doubled back. His head had pounded all day since he'd woken up. Sipping from his canteen only helped a little, and looking into the sky for the smoke made it worse. This time he located the gate to what was probably a neighborhood not too many years ago. It wasn't like a real fortress gate, but just decorative. Poison ivy vines rendered it nearly invisible. It had been a nice neighborhood. Lots of wooded acres around every abandoned, decaying house, each house designed with a cabin aesthetic, but as big as mansions. The smoke rose from the top of the hill. Hudson cut his eyes from side to side. There weren't many people left in the world, but he still didn't want to take the chance of getting caught off guard by any other survivors. This should have been safe in theory. Smoke columns communicated a particular set of expectations. Not exactly friendly, but not purely hostile either. The strange custom had become to leave any extra cooked food on plates out at the edge of your camp. It said, "We're friendly enough to share what we can, but you're not invited any closer." Hudson made the next rise and saw the end of the street in a sloppy twist of bushes and uncleared road. The fire was around here. Hudson had taken a few meals this way. He was no hunter and could barely start a fire, so fresh cooked meat was quite a treat. He occasionally started his own fires and left a plate out, but never had a visitor. He ended up eating his extras himself, alone. As the last mailbox came into view, he saw a girl with about his age standing at the head of that driveway at, let's say, I know, I'm not supposed to be fixing things, in front of another decorative gate. An open gate. He stopped short. Running into people on the road was so rare as to be shocking. She was a little shorter than him. She wore jeans and a pullover jacket of some kind. She had no pack. She looked clean, and that seemed weird to Hudson. The lack of dirt on her skin and in her clean hair made her glow like an angel to him, and it was terrifying. Hudson had never had a fight in his life. I'm not going to fix it. All right. Hudson had never had a fight in his life with anyone before or after the plague years, but his hands touched the gun in one pocket of his pack, and then the knife on his hip before dropping back to his sides. He folded and unfolded his arms several times. What the hell did he do with his arms back when he used to see people all the time? She turned her eyes onto him, and he felt a deep, cold wash down through his body into his tingling fingers and toes. She didn't look the least bit scared or surprised to see him. That somehow scared him even more. How far up could he wind himself before something popped in his already aching head? She said, You can go ahead of me. I need another minute, maybe." He knew all the words she used, but they made no sense to him. What? His voice croaked out the sound of the word like a neglected instrument. She tilted her head and smiled. Warmth replaced the cold and felt terribly hot by comparison. "I know it sounds silly, especially after being here for several days, but I'm still new. I'm still new here and don't quite feel at home yet." I think it's starting to rain outside, so you may get to hear that as I'm reading here. Hudson tried to explain himself, but all he could produce in the way of language was another "what." Can you hear that? That's crazy. He cleared his throat, and it sounded like rolling gravel. He thought he tasted blood. How rusty did you have to be at talking for your throat to bleed when you tried? She squinted and shook her head. Hudson flashed back to the awkward days of high school that were never to return. "I'm Lily. I only got here a few days ago. Hell, it might have been a week by now, but it still feels strange to me to be around so many people. And now we're having this party." Okay, words, Hudson thought. Use some words like in the old days. I just got here. I don't know what. Lily's eyes got wide and she said, "Oh, I'm so sorry. This must be confusing as hell. Do you want to come with me and I can introduce you to everyone?" "Everyone?" "Well, everyone isn't here now, but they will be as the party really gets going." Hudson located the column of smoke in the sky over the trees and then attuned to Lily's face again. Party? Yeah, Mr. Hemingway thought it would be a good way for everyone to bond now that so many of us are together. Mr. Hemingway. He owns the house. He's the only old man I've seen since everything fell apart in the last wave of sickness. He may not be that old, but compared to everyone else... Right, Hudson said. He was proud of how very normal that word sounded and felt off his tongue. Come on, I'll show you. Lily held out a hand and Hudson shuffled toward her. His hands had the mad urge to go to his weapons again, but he reached for her hand instead. She turned and walked through the gate before he could take it. Maybe holding hands wasn't what that gesture meant. Maybe that was just a come along kind of wave. Hudson honestly couldn't remember from before. He had to. He walked beside her on her left and about a half step behind. She had to turn her head to address him as they walked up the winding path together. Where were you before? He had to think before he could answer. Before I came up the road? Before everyone died, she said. He swallowed a couple times and tried to remember where he put his canteen. I was over in Rockdale. Rockdale. Her eyes sort of crossed, and she looked up into the trees instead of at him. Like 100 miles west of here? Hudson looked up at clear blue sky between the thicker branches, as if that would help. I don't know. I think I've been going in circles for a long time. Like Moses, she said. What? Never mind. What high school did you go to? He paused again. Davenport. Bulldogs? What? Your school mascot. Were you Bulldogs? No, Blue Devils. Okay. That seemed to be it as the cabin-like mansion came into view. It had a wide turnaround that seemed well kept. A number of cars and bikes were parked around the pavement and up onto the patchy grass. This cabin-like mansion had a number of wings that spoked off from the main body of the house. None of that detail stuck with him as Hudson stopped in place. Even in the afternoon daylight, he could see electric lights through the windows. He felt sort of dizzy and out of time, like dreaming awake. Lights, he said. For a couple seconds, he wasn't sure he had used the right word. Oh, right, Lily slapped her forehead. I guess I'm more used to this than I thought. Yeah, Mr. Hemingway hooked up generators and green energy stuff. There are other lights around the spillover houses around the lake. It was kind of hard to hear her over all the geese. Spillover lake? Yes, we have quite a gathering of new friends. Maybe the start of a new civilization, and we're on a lake. Come on. Hand out again. He didn't try to take it this time, but followed her. Some of the geese started laughing. Hudson was already trailing her through the front door when he realized the geese were people talking. A huge crowd of people. Excuse me, I'm sorry. Let's see. A huge crowd of people. Hudson held on to the fine wood of the foyer as he stared at the most people he had seen since I left my mom at the hospital. He finished the thought out loud. You'll have to speak up now, Hudson. It was like she was yelling at him and his gut filled with watery fear. It's a party after all. This time she did take his hand and lead him forward. Holding Lily's warm hand and his clammy one made him feel weaker instead of comforted. People bumped into him as they weaved through the crowd. A guy stepped on Hudson's foot. Another elbowed him in the spine as that guy was laughing so loud it sounded like a howl. I gotta fight the temptation. It sounded like a howl to Hudson. They got into a bit of a clearing between the kitchen and the living room. All right, my wife is texting me pictures of them kayaking. They got into a bit of a clearing between the kitchen and the large living room area. She dropped his hand and he missed her touch immediately. She yelled at him, "Are you hungry?" "What? I mean, yes," he yelled back. She swept her hand along the entire back wall. Tables upon tables of cooked food spread as far as he could see. He wandered away from her in shock. So much, too much to be real. Hudson reached out with one shaking palm and felt the warmth rising off the trays. Bacon. Bacon-wrapped food. Where did the bacon come from? Hudson wasn't a savage. He remembered bacon came from pigs, of course. But what pig supplied this bacon? He popped one bacon-wrapped something in his mouth and had to hold on to the edge of the table to stay on his feet. It was some kind of meat, but he couldn't tell what. It was just savory heaven. Maybe some other pork. Pig-wrapped pig, Hudson mumbled over a mouthful. He started to giggle, and then couldn't stop. He coughed and choked, but refused to lose the food. He swallowed it down and then popped another and another. It wasn't all the same bacon-wrapped stuff. Was that a scallop? Couldn't have been. Cooked in butter? The flavor was so intense it made the back of his jaw hurt. Butter meant milk and cows, right? The next one might have been a bacon-wrapped Brussels sprout. He hated Brussels sprouts, but then swallowed three more whole. His mother would be so proud, the mother he left to bleed to death alone and sick in an overrun hospital. He started coughing again, even as he shoved more food in his mouth. A hand patted his back and offered a mug of something to drink around his side. Hudson gulped it down. It was cold, and the shock of cold liquid for the first time in forever stopped his choking. Then the flavor hit, and he thought it was cold urine for a split second. He almost spit it out across the buffet, but then his distant memory identified beer. It was cold beer. The cold made his headache more intense for a moment, but then the pain melted away by degrees. He felt a stupid grin across his entire face. He turned around to face two young men, a little older than him and cleaner. The smile dropped, and he had a second where he thought he should hit them or bite them. "Hudson," Lily said. She was still there. He drew closer to her as he kept his eyes on the two guys still smiling at him. All the moving bodies throughout the house added to his hysteria, his near hysteria. Hudson had an image in his head of writhing snakes, and his skin crawled. He thought he was breaking out in a cold sweat, but then realized the vent above his head was blowing cold air. "Air conditioning," he whispered. Both the guys laughed. One of them held up a fist and said, "Fucking A." Lily introduced the one who spoke first as Evan. The other was Kent. They held out hands, and Hudson started to back away, but then he remembered shaking hands. He did his best to mimic the old tradition. There was a time when touching hands was an invitation to get sick. That uneasy fear lingered in Hudson as he wiped off his hand on his gritty pants. "Lily says you went to Davenport," Kent said. Hudson had to pull up the name in his mind again. "Yes." "I think we played you in football," Evan said, "at least in one playoff game." Hudson nodded. "I think I might have seen you," Kent said. "Were you in theater?" "What theater?" "Oh, theater classes." "Yes." "Did you do the one acts the last year before the lockdowns?" "One act play competition." Hudson tried the words out, and they seemed to make sense in their own alien way. "Yes." "Crazy," Kent said. "You never find anyone you really know anymore. Glad you're here." Hudson didn't feel like they really knew each other at all, but he nodded and forced a smile. It was starting to feel like high school again. If the world hadn't ended, he'd be in college now, Hudson calculated in his head. He couldn't figure out why that fact would matter. Evan asked, "Did you get vaccinated? Before everything went to hell, I mean?" Hudson shook his head and worried this might be the end of his invitation to bacon-wrapped heaven. "I was too young back then. We all were," Evan said. "Yet we're the ones still alive, except Mr. Hemingway. He got a shot before the end, for whatever that was worth." "Where is he?" Hudson asked. Another girl walked up before anyone could answer, and Kent said, "This is Sadie. She went to Whittemore." That meant nothing to Hudson, but he said, "Oh, cool." He lifted the beer in her direction and then took a deep swallow. Evan said, "Hudson literally just got here. Can you imagine?" "We all just got here at some point," she said. They turned, and Hudson was shoveling food into his mouth again. "Help yourself," Kent laughed. Lily pulled at Hudson's shoulder and said, "You have to be careful. If you haven't eaten in a while, your brain doesn't remember when to tell your body to stop." Hudson swallowed and wiped his mouth on his sleeve. "Oh, okay, thank you." He looked longingly at the food everyone else seemed to just be picking at. Oh, I got two justs here. I'm going to need to fix that. All right. Seemed to just be picking at. She took his empty mug and said, How about a cold water?" He accepted, and they walked out on the back deck. It was a mild day, but they had a fire pit going in the middle distance on a cobbled section of the yard. Mowed grass sloped down to the lake, which reflected bright sun in mad sparkles. Hudson missed the air conditioning immediately. "How did you do it?" she asked. "What?" Every time he said this word, he felt dumber. It was like being a barking dog instead of a person having a conversation with a lovely young woman. "How did you survive? Did you know how to hunt?" Hudson snorted at that, and it hurt his sinuses. He took a swallow of cold water, but it barely helped. I, mostly canned goods and moving from house to house. She nodded and sighed. It was scary, but I slept in a tent everywhere I went. I was afraid to go into houses because of all the bodies. Unless it was really cold, and then I'd try to find an empty house. Did you sleep on beds? Hudson asked. She tilted her head at him, and he felt stupid again. I just mean, I always slept on couches, she said. Even with the beds empty, it felt weird. He sighed and blinked away the start of tears. Me too. Yeah, me too. Always on couches, never the beds. She patted his shoulder and said, we can probably find you a bed or a comfortable couch for tonight after everything is over. She swallowed a couple times. He swallowed a couple times and nodded, but thought of no words to go along with his agreement. I have to set up a few things. Will you be okay on your own for a little while? She asked. He stared at Lily and swallowed a couple more times. Sure. His voice hardly shook at all. But as he watched her go, he was certain he'd never see her again. Hudson drank down the water that he didn't remember picking up. Kent, Evan, Sadie, and a half-dozen others passed him on their way outside. Someone he didn't know asked him, "Are you going to wear that backpack forever?" Why would he put it down? It had all his survival gear. No one else was wearing packs or stowing weapons. He supposed that did look weird. Finally, he said, I might take it off later. The group was already gone by then. He stood around outside a while and then went back inside, where he ate his way up and down the tables. He kept eating long after he knew he was full, but finally tore himself away. He fell into an empty leather chair under a cold vent and sat there for hours. He still wore his pack bunched between his sweaty back and the leather of the chair. People stopped, introduced themselves, spoke of their past, welcomed him, offered drinks that he took, and moved on. He retained none of their names and could hardly recall their faces. Such mental skills were rustier for him than his conversation skills. One girl sat for a long time and told him a meandering story about how she got out of the city alone. He could not remember her name or what city. She finally moved on. She was friendly and pretty, but she wasn't Lily. He couldn't figure out why that would matter to him, but it did. Another guy talked about hot wiring cars and turning grease into engine fuel. He mentioned Mr. Hemingway a couple times, but never paused long enough for Hudson to ask any questions about the guy who owned the house and threw the party. Someone came along to pull the talker away for some Jell-O shots. The Jell-O interested Hudson more than the alcohol, but they didn't invite him. "Good to meet you," the guy said as he stood. "I'll see you around, man." The guy held out a fist just like either Evan or Kent had done earlier. Hudson couldn't remember which one of them had done it. There was a pause. "Bump it, dude." Hudson blinked a couple times, but then registered what the guy meant. He fist bumped him. Then the guy was gone along with his name. Hudson's stomach gurgled with angry urgency. He jumped to go outside to take care of it. There were people everywhere, and he started to panic. How did people handle bathroom emergencies back when there were people standing around everywhere? Bathrooms. The answer was right there in the question. If Mr. Hemingway's house had electric lights, cold beer, and bacon-wrapped everything cooked in butter, he likely had working bathrooms like from before the plague. Bathroom. Hudson called out to the group closest to him. They just stared at first. Was it not polite to use that word? Excuse me. Then most of them pointed down a hallway beyond the kitchen. A couple others pointed in different directions back through the crowd. He followed the directions of the majority. He found it, closed the door, parked himself there for a long time, much like the leather chair. He managed not to throw up as he sat on the toilet, which was quite a victory. The bathroom being so frosty cold helped a great deal. He shed his back onto the tiled floor with a clunk from the gun inside. The cold air on his sweaty back helped too. Hudson finally flushed for the last time. He turned on the sink without thinking about the fact that this was the first working faucet he had encountered in years. He splashed his face instead of washing his hands. Dirt ran dark into the sink. He used the flowery-smelling soap to wash himself more. Then he turned to the shower. Hudson stripped down and sat under the cold flow of water from the massaging showerhead for quite a while. A couple people knocked, but eventually gave up and went away. There were probably plenty of bathrooms, he decided. He turned on the hot water for a couple minutes and realized he forgot how great hot showers were. After drying off, even putting on his cleanest clothes felt dirty to him. He re-shouldered his pack and made his way through the house, got more cold water, bypassed the food, and sat down on a low stone wall outside as the wind off the lake blew through his wet hair. It felt good. It took his attention off his ailing stomach and the headache that would sneak back in just as he'd finally forgotten about it. He watched the sun set over the water, listening to the overlapping conversations all around him like geese. Lily walked by as the darkness started to deepen, and she stopped. "Hudson, I've been looking everywhere for you. I didn't mean to leave you fending for yourself so long on your first day. Did you go swimming?" He looked out over the lake, and his breath caught in his throat as he saw lights come on in other houses along the shore. They reflected in the darkening waters. So beautiful. He felt tears sting his eyes. "Hudson?" He blinked several times and ran his hands through his wet, clean hair. "No, I didn't swim." "You changed clothes?" "I took a shower." He looked up at her like he expected to get in trouble. She smiled and leaned in to kiss his cheek. He started to turn his mouth toward her as she pulled away. Lily offered her hand instead, and he took it before she could change her mind. "Kent and Evan found some fireworks," she said. "Mr. Hemingway said they could shoot them away from the house off the dock over the lake. Want to come?" "I'll go anywhere." Hudson stopped himself before he said, "with you." It felt dangerous. It felt too dangerous to say it even if it was true, especially if it was true. She laughed and pulled him to his feet. He reached back and adjusted his pack as they marched down the grassy slope together. He didn't even think about his weapons as he did so. The darkness of the night set in heavy as they reached the water. Kent, Evan, Sadie, and a couple others gathered on the dock as they set up the rockets in some sort of metal bucket. Others stood or sat along the shore, stretching out in both directions. "You see a good spot for us?" Lily asked. He stared at her a long moment. When her eyes narrowed, he looked quickly away. "How about there?" They walked over to a patch of grass under a tree. Hudson shed his pack again for the second time that day, counting his long bathroom visit. They settled in with their backs against the tree and their shoulders touching. Hudson breathed out slowly in a long sigh, and all his tensions and fears left him in that moment. "That sounded like it came from your soul," she said. "I'd forgotten what it was like to be a person, what it was like to not be." When the pause felt too long to him, Lily saved him the awkward trouble. What it was like to not be alone. After she said it, his lips trembled. He wiped his eyes on the back of one clean hand. Lily took his other hand in both of hers as she leaned against him and the tree. He looked up in the sky. "Clouds. I hope it doesn't rain soon. It's too nice out here for that." She looked up and shook her head. "Sky is clear." He squinted. "The stars, though." She smiled and reminded him. Lights make them hard to see sometimes. That fact was familiar to him and rose up from somewhere deep in his memory, from back before all the sickness and death started, back when he felt alive. The fireworks ripped up into the air in yellow-orange trails, brighter than the sun against the settling darkness of starless night over the lake. They both startled each and every time one ripped off. When they exploded overhead, the sparks spread out like the fronds of a burning palm tree. Hudson squeezed Lily's hand tighter, and she returned the pressure. He tasted something savory on his lips and coughed out whatever it was. Sorry, I lost my place. Hudson wiped his mouth and nose. In the artificial light all around him, he saw his hand covered in blood. He coughed again and brought up more of the stuff, clotted with loose tissue. His vision blurred as he blinked on bloody tears. Then he felt more of the stuff dripping out of one ear. He tried to get up, but lacked the energy as he choked on the stuff in his throat. Others all around Lily and him were cheering and shouting up at the exploding fireworks. His distress was lost in all that commotion. Hudson tried to pull his hand away from her grasp, but Lily had locked down on him and wasn't letting go. "I shouldn't be here," he choked out the words from a thick, wet throat. "I think I'm sick." Those were the scariest words from the last days of the world of people. She leaned heavy against him, and all he could say was, "I'm so sorry." Lily started to fall forward. Her grip fell away from his hand. Hudson caught her and held her upright against his side. He put his arm around her and lifted her chin with his fingers. He was about to cry out for help, even if it meant others discovering what had happened to him. But in the next burst of gunpowder above their heads, he saw that she bled like a faucet from both her nostrils. Her eyes rolled up to the whites that were now shock red from all the burst vessels, just like his mom. His mom would have liked Lily, he thought. He hugged her close against his side as they leaned on the tree together. Her breathing slowed as the party went on into the night, and for a while they went unnoticed.